13. A plan of attack. Back in Bayport, the boys discussed their visit to the house on the cliff from all angles. None was satisfied with the explanation the red-headed man had given about the presence of the blood-stained cap in the house. "I'm sure he knows more about it than he cares to tell," declared Frank. The other chap started to claim it at first, and then he stepped in with his story, Chet pointed out. "That's the most suspicious part of it. And then, when I went into the kitchen in the first place, why should he have hidden the cap?" "It's a mighty mysterious thing," Joe said. "The fact that Dad has disappeared and the fact that there are bloodstains on that cap. We ought to turn it over to Chief Collig," suggested Phil. The boys looked at one another doubtfully. Chief of Police Collig was a fat, pompous official who had never been blessed by a superabundance of brains. His chief satellite and aide-de-camp was Oscar Smuff, a detective of the Bayport police force. As Chet was fond of remarking, if you put both their brains together you'd have enough for a half-wit. "I don't think it would do much good," said Frank. "But it wouldn't do any harm either. Collig might be able to throw a scare into them, anyway, if he went up to that house and began asking questions." The boys, therefore, trooped down to the police station and, after stating their business to the desk sergeant, were admitted to the chief's private office. They found Chief Collig and Detective Smuff deep in a game of checkers. "It's your move, Smuff," said the chief. "What is it, boys?" he demanded, looking up. Frank, producing the blood-stained cap, explained how and where it had been found. Smuff, in the meantime, scratched his head diligently for a while, then captured one of his opponent's kings. Chief Collig grunted, whether in disappointment at the loss of the king or in acknowledgement of the information about the cap, the boys could not say. "So it's Fenton Hardy's cap, eh?" asked the chief. "It's his, all right." "And what do you think has happened to him?" "We don't know. That's what we want you to help find out. But, by the look of this cap, we're afraid there's been foul play." "Just a minute, Smuff, just a minute." The chief contemplated the checkerboard for a few minutes, then made a move. He settled back in his chair. "Now try and beat that," he said, and looked up at the boys again. "What do you want me to do?" he inquired. "Help us find him." The chief regarded them benevolently. "Meb he'll show up in a day or so." "He's been missing long enough already," protested Joe. "We want you to go up to the Palukka place and question those people. They know more about the affair than they care to tell." "The Palukka place," exclaimed the chief, pursing his lips. "Well, you see, it ain't in the city limits." "But Fenton Hardy is a Bayport citizen. What do you think about it, Smuff?" "Just a minute, it's my move." Smuff meditated over the checkerboard for a while, made his move, then looked up judicially. "To tell you the truth, Chief," he said, "I think we'd be just as well staying away from that Palukka place. There's been queer stories about it." "That's what I think," agreed the chief. "Do you mean to say you won't help us look for him?" exclaimed Frank. "Oh, we'll keep our eyes open," the chief promised. "But he'll show up all right. He'll show up. Don't worry." "He'll never show up if we wait for the Bayport Police Department to get into action," declared Chet warmly. "Is that so?" said Chief Collig, nettled. Of course, Chief, said Frank smoothly, if you're afraid to go up to the Palukka place just because it's supposed to be haunted, don't bother. We can tell the newspapers that we believe our father has met with foul play and that you won't bother to look into the matter, but don't let us disturb you at all. What's that about the newspapers? Demanded the chief, getting up from his chair so suddenly that he upset the checkerboard over Smuff's lap. Don't let this get into the papers. The chief was constantly afraid of publicity unless it was of the most favorable nature. The taxpayers mightn't like it, suggested Joe. They pay you to enforce the law, and if they know you're afraid to go up to the Palukka place. Now, said the chief nervously. Who said anything about being afraid of the Palukka place? Can't you take a joke? Of course I'll go up and investigate this, at least I'll send Smuff up. Who, me? Demanded Smuff, in alarm. Smuff and me, we'll go up together. I'm doggone sure I won't go up alone, declared Smuff. Well, as long as we're sure you'll investigate, we won't say anything to the newspapers, said Frank, and Chief Collig breathed a sigh of relief. That's fine, he said. Smuff and me, we'll go up there first thing tomorrow morning, and if we find out anything we'll let you know. But although Chief Collig and Detective Smuff duly departed from Bayport the next morning in an exceptionally noisy and decrepit flivver, with Smuff perched nervously at the wheel, they returned before noon with the news that they had been able to discover nothing further regarding Fenton Hardy. They had, they said, called at the house, but the people there had given a reasonable explanation as to the finding of the cap. Real nice people, they were too, added Chief Collig. The man said he found the cap on the road, and why should he tell a lie about it? So Smuff and me, we came away. Yes, agreed Smuff profoundly, we came away. In a hurry, suggested Joe sarcastically. Collig and Smuff looked uncomfortable. To tell the truth, they had been so impressed by the fearful stories they had heard of the house on the cliff that they had stayed no longer than was necessary. They had merely asked a few perfunctory questions of Redhead, had received his explanation of the finding of the cap, and had then hastened from the farm as quickly as was consistent with dignity. We've done our duty, declared Chief Collig. No man can do more. And with that the boys had to be content. But they were not satisfied. There's some connection between this smuggling outfit and the house on the cliff, declared Frank. This man Snackley is mixed up in all this, I'm sure. Didn't Mother say he was related to Felix Palukka? Yes, and isn't it likely that he inherited the Palukka farm after the old miser died? Perhaps that's what encouraged him to move his smuggling operations here. Perhaps Snackley was one of the two men we saw at the farm. I wouldn't be surprised, said Frank. But what I'm thinking of is this: where did these two motorboats come from that day Jones was shot? We didn't see them out in the bay. They seemed to come right out from under the cliff. Do you mean you think there is a secret harbor in there? There might be. Look at it this way. Snackley was the man who got Jones that day, as he said. Snackley was related to Palukka, and may now own the farm. Snackley has been smuggling in Barmet Bay from some base that the government men have been unable to find. Perhaps that base is the Palukka farm. But it's on top of the cliff. There may be a secret passage from the house to some hidden harbor at the foot of the cliff. Gosh, Frank, it sounds reasonable. And perhaps that explains why the kidnappers got away with Jones so quickly that day. If they left the Kane farmhouse just a little while before we did, we should have been able to get within sight of them, anyway. But we didn't. You mean they turned in at the Palaka place? Why not? Probably Jones is hidden there right now. That is, if they haven't killed him, he added hesitatingly. But what could have happened to Dad? That's what we're going to find out. What do you say to asking Tony if his father will lend us his motorboat and let us investigate the foot of that cliff? What do you expect to find? We'll find out if there's any place where motorboats could be hidden. And if we get any information, we can turn it over to the government officials and have the Palaka place raided. Then we'll get some satisfaction out of it, anyway, and perhaps find out what happened to Dad. 14. Private property. The Hardy boys explained their plan to Tony Preto, who promised to ask his father about the motorboat provided they allowed him to go with them. I wouldn't miss it for anything, he said. You let me come along on this trip with you and I'll see that we get the boat. We wouldn't go without you, Tony, promised Frank. I'll have the boat tomorrow afternoon. Be at the boathouse. Tony was as good as his word. When Frank and Joe appeared at the little boathouse, one of a long row of ramshackle buildings along the shore, next afternoon, they found Tony clad in a greasy suit of overalls, tinkering with the engine. He was of a mechanical turn of mind and could never see an engine of any kind without investigating its most intricate machinery. She'll run as smoothly as a sewing machine, he declared, looking up. We can start any time. Your father let you have the boat, all right? You bet. I told him it was to help find your father, and he was almost going to quit work and come along with us. The boys got into the motorboat, which was a rangy, powerful craft with graceful lines, and the engine was soon roaring. The boat, which was called the Napoli in honor of Mr. Preto's birthplace in Italy, moved slowly out into the waters of the bay and then gathered speed as it headed toward the gloomy cliffs at the northern extremity of Barmet Bay. It was already late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast and the bay was rough. The salt spray dashed over the bows of the Napoli as it plunged on through the breakers. Bayport soon became a smoky haze on the hillside. The boys could see the white line of the shore road rising and falling on the coast to the north, and at last they came within sight of the cane farm, nestled among the trees. The cliff upon which the Palaka place stood was stark and sheer against the background of ocean and sky, and at the top they could see the grove of trees and the roof and chimneys of the haunted house. Lonely-looking place, remarked Joe. Pretty steep cliff, Tony observed. I can't see how anyone could make his way up and down that slope to get to the house. That's just why nobody has thought of the possibility of the place as a smuggling base, said Frank. It doesn't look possible. But perhaps when we look around we'll find that things are different. Tony steered the boat closer in toward the shore so that it would not be visible from the Palaka place. Then he slackened speed so that the roar of the engine would not be so noticeable, and the craft made its way along toward the bottom of the cliff. There were currents here that demanded skillful navigation, but Tony brought the Napoli through them easily, and at last the boat was surging along close to the face of the cliff. The boys scanned the formidable wall of rock eagerly. It was scarred and seamed, and at the base had been eaten away by the battering of the waves. Time passed, and there was no indication of a path, and the lads were disappointed. The cliff jutted up out of very deep water and rose to a great height. From the boat they were unable to see the Palaka place, for it was set in a short distance from the edge of the cliff. The face of the steep rock was uncompromising. There seemed to be no foothold for man or beast. It was just an unscalable, craggy wall. Suddenly Tony bore down on the wheel. The Napoli swerved swiftly to one side, and at the same time the engine roared as the craft leaped ahead. Frank and Joe looked quickly around. What's the matter? They asked, in alarm. But Tony was gazing fixedly ahead. He was tense and alert. Another shift of the wheel and the Napoli swerved again. Then the Hardy boys saw the danger. There were rocks at the base of the cliff. One of them, black and sharp, like an ugly tooth, jutted out of the water almost immediately at the side of the boat. Only Tony's quick eye had saved them from striking against it. They had blundered into a veritable maze of reefs which extended for several yards ahead. They held their breath. It seemed impossible that they could run the gauntlet of those rocks without tearing the bottom out of the craft. But Tony's steersmanship was marvelous. The motorboat threaded its way accurately among the jutting rocks. There was always the chance that a submerged reef might rip through the hull of the craft, but they had to take chances on that. But luck was with them. The Napoli dodged the last ugly rock and shot forward into open water. Tony sank back with a sigh of relief. "Phew, that was close," he exclaimed. "I didn't see those rocks until we were right on top of them. If we'd ever struck one of them, we would have been goners." The Hardy boys believed him. Angry waves dashed against the base of the cliff. They would not have lived more than a few minutes if they had been wrecked in this place. They would have been battered to pieces against the rocks. Suddenly, before them, they saw an opening in the side of the cliff. It was a long, narrow cove. The entrance was like the neck of a bottle, widening as it led into the cliff, and it was overshadowed by jutting rocks. It had been quite invisible up to this time, and the boat had gone only a few yards further before it became invisible again, so well was the opening hidden by the rocks. "Here's a find," exclaimed Frank, in excitement. "Let's turn back and see where this goes to." Tony swung the boat around and the craft slowly made its way back toward the hidden cove. Soon the opening in the cliff came into view again. "It's just large enough for the boat to go through," said Tony. "Want me to try it?" Frank nodded. "Go ahead." The nose of the boat turned toward this strange bay and then the Napoli began to enter the cove. "Maybe I won't be able to get out again," said Tony suddenly. He looked ahead. But the passage widened into a bay of considerable extent, quite sufficient in size to enable him to turn the craft around once he had entered. So he continued. But the cove proved uninteresting. The sides were steep, although dense bushes grew about the base of the slopes, but there was no path, no trail, no indication that any human being had ever been in the place. Being protected from the wind, the water was calm. The echoes of the motorboat's engine were flung back from every side in a roaring volume. Suddenly Frank gave a gasp of surprise. Standing among the thickets at the base of the steepest slope was a man. He was very tall and he wore a black felt hat, the wide brim of which obscured the upper part of his face. His countenance was tanned and weather-beaten, his lips were thin and cruel. He wore a short black jacket, and he stood with his hands plunged into the side pockets and his feet spread wide apart, in the manner of a seaman. He was standing there quietly, gazing at them without a shadow of expression on his sinister face, as motionless as a statue. When he saw that he was observed, he called out, "Leave this place." Tony throttled down the engine. The three boys stared at the man in the black hat as though he were an apparition. "Leave this place," he repeated, in a curiously metallic voice. "We aren't doing any harm," replied Frank. "Not now," said the stranger. "But don't land here." "Why?" "You don't have to ask why. This is private property. You can't land here. You'd better leave at once." The boys hesitated. As though to emphasize his commands, the man in the black hat reached suddenly into his pocket and whipped out a wicked-looking revolver. Then he folded his arms, tapping the barrel of the revolver against one shoulder very deliberately. "Turn that boat around and get out of here," he snapped. "Don't come back. Don't ever come back. Don't ever try to land here. This is private property. If you ever do land here, you'll be shot." The boys were unarmed. They realized that nothing would be gained by argument. Tony slowly brought the boat around. Goodbye, shouted Joe cheerfully. The stranger did not reply. He stood there, gazing fixedly after them, his arms still folded, still tapping the revolver against his shoulder as the motorboat made its way out of the strange bay, out into open water. Looks as if he didn't want us around, remarked Tony, as soon as the Napoli was out of the cove. I'll say he didn't, exclaimed Frank. What a wicked-looking customer he was. I expected to see him start popping at us with that gun of his before we got out. I don't want to run into him again, Joe declared. He sure gave us our orders. And he meant them, too. I wonder who he is, said Tony. Do you think, fellows? Do you think it could have been Snackley? Shouted Frank. 15. Smugglers. The thought struck Frank Hardy like a thunderbolt. The appearance of the stranger had been so sinister, he was so evidently a lawless and desperate man who was accustomed to being obeyed, and his presence in this place indicated too clearly that he had some connection with the house on the cliff, that Frank's deduction seemed quite logical. Snackley, exclaimed Joe. It must be him. The head of the smugglers. I've never seen a picture of Snackley and I've never heard him described, said Joe. But that fellow looks just as I had pictured Snackley would look. He's a leader of some kind, you can tell that by his manner, put in Tony Preto. He's the fellow who chased Jones that day in the motorboat. And he'll chase us, too, declared Tony, if we don't get away from here pretty quick. Why should we go now? Demanded Frank. We've stumbled on something important. That may be the Smuggler's Cove. But how do they get to the house if you think they have anything to do with the Palooka place? Asked Tony. Those cliffs in there are mighty steep. There must be some way that we don't know of. What do you say we hang around here for a while and see what we can do? Tony became infected with the enthusiasm of the Hardy boys and he readily agreed to keep the motorboat in the vicinity of the cliff, although it was decided that they should not remain too near, but cruise up and down the shore in case the sharp-eyed man should be watching them. It was a good thing we didn't put up an argument with that fellow, said Frank, at last. I'll say it was. Tony agreed emphatically. We didn't have much chance to argue with that revolver he had. I don't mean that. He may think we were just out for a cruise and accidentally wandered into that cove. If he knew we were hunting for Dad, he might have acted very differently. That's true, too, said Joe. Well, we won't go home just yet. It was late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast and twilight was falling. A cold wind blew in from the sea. The motorboat went some distance down the shore and then they turned and, keeping well out in the bay, went on up past the cliff once again. They kept a sharp eye on the location of the cove, and in spite of the fact that they knew just where it was, they were scarcely able to distinguish the narrow opening in the rocks. No wonder the place hasn't been heard of more often, Frank said. It looks like an unbroken wall of rock from this far out. You've got to be careful around here, Tony, cried Joe. First thing you know we'll hit the rocks and be smashed. That's right, added Frank. It's pretty dangerous so close to the cliff. You leave it to me, came from their schoolmate. I know how to handle this boat. It was true, Tony did know how to handle the motorboat, yet several times they came perilously close to the rocks over which the waves were dashing. In fact, once there came a slight bump followed by a grating sound which made the hearts of all the boys leap into their mouths. "Narrow squeak, that," admitted Tony. "I guess I'd better keep out a little farther, after all." "I certainly should," answered Frank. Although they cruised around for more than an hour, they saw not the slightest sign of life either about the base of the cliff or on the Palukka place, which, keeping well out from shore as they did, they could plainly distinguish. As the gloom deepened, they felt that it was almost useless to continue, but Frank decided that they should wait a while longer. "These fellows aren't likely to move around much in daylight. Night is the time for their operations," he pointed out. "We'll hang around for a while longer." Twilight deepened into darkness and the lights of Bayport could be seen as a yellow haze through the mist at the distant extremity of the bay. The cliff was but a dark smudge in the night and the waves broke against the rocks with a lonely sound. Suddenly, through the darkness, they heard a muffled sound. Their own boat was running along quietly and they listened. "Another boat," remarked Tony, in a whisper. It was, indeed, another motorboat, and it was near the base of the cliff. At last they could distinguish a faint light, and toward this light they began to move slowly. They were tense with excitement. Everything might depend on the events of the next few minutes. When they had gone in toward the cliff as far as they dared, creeping up from the west, they could make out the gloomy outline of the other motorboat, which was making its way slowly out of the very face of the cliff itself. At first they could not imagine how the craft had got in so close nor where it was coming from. They crept up closer, at imminent danger of discovery, and at imminent danger of being washed ashore on the rocks. Then, finally, they heard the other boat slow down, heard the faint clatter of oars, then voices. After that, with an abrupt roar that startled them, the other motorboat suddenly plunged on out into the bay. They could hear it threshing on its way out toward sea at an ever-increasing rate of speed. "Where is it going?" said Tony, in amazement. Frank cautioned for silence. "There's a rowboat around here," he whispered. "Lay low." They waited in silence and at last they heard the rattle of oars again. This time the sound was closer. The rowboat was drawing near. Fortunately the wind was from the sea and it blew the sounds toward them, at the same time keeping the men in the boat from hearing the muffled murmur of their own craft. The rattle of oars continued and at last the boys could see the dim shape of the boat through the gloom. Finally they could distinguish the words of the dark figures in the craft. At a sign from Frank, Tony cut off the engine for the time being. But they could not make out complete sentences. The wind would whisk toward them a fragment of speech and then the rest of the words would be drowned. £300, they heard a harsh voice saying, and then the rest of the sentence was lost. A dull murmur of voices. Finally. "I don't know. It's risky." The wind died for a moment and then through the gloom the boys saw that the rowboat was heading directly in toward the face of the cliff. It was not many yards away and as it passed by they heard the harsh voice again. "Li Chang's share," he was saying. No, we mustn't forget that, they heard a gruff voice reply. I hope they get away all right. What are you worrying about? Of course they'll get away. We've been watched, you know. It's all your imagination. Nobody suspects. Those boys at the house. Just kids. If they come nosing around again, we'll knock one of them on the head. I don't like this rough stuff. It's dangerous. We've got to do it or we'll end up in the pen. You can't be white-livered in this game. What's the matter with you tonight? You're nervous. I'm worried. I've got a hunch that we'd better clear out of here. Clear out, replied the other contemptuously. Are you crazy? Why, this place is as safe as a church. We can make a big clean-up before they know we're in this part of the country at all. Well, maybe you're right, said the first man doubtfully. But still. His voice died away as the boat went on into the cove. The boys could hear the rattle of oars and then a dull swishing of bushes, a muttered voice, and then silence fell. The boys looked at one another through the gloom. Smugglers, exclaimed Frank. Sounds mighty like it, replied Tony. What do you think we should do? Follow them. Sure, Joe agreed. Follow them right into the cove. But Tony demurred, though as he spoke he started up the engine again. Count me out, he said. I don't like that talk about being knocked on the head. I may be foolish, but I'm not that foolish. There are 3 of us. And we don't know how many more of them. And they're grown men. I don't want to be trapped in that cove. Besides, the motorboat makes too much noise. They'd hear us coming and then we'd be done for. This phase of the matter had not occurred to the Hardy boys, but they saw that it was reasonable. In the darkness it would be risky entering the narrow passage to the cove and then, as Tony said, it was probable that their approach would be heard. I hate to let them get away when we've got such a clue as this, said Frank. There's no doubt they are smugglers. The men in that motorboat probably are going out to a ship for a cargo of smuggled goods, or else they have delivered a cargo and are on their way back. But where on earth did the motorboat come from? Exclaimed Joe. There wasn't any boat in the cove when we were in there. Probably well hidden, said Frank. There were a lot of bushes growing close down to the water's edge, I noticed. They'd have some sort of a hiding place fixed up. But where did all those men come from? That's what we're going to find out. There must be some connection between this cove and the house on the cliff. I'm going ashore. Somebody's got to stay with the motorboat, said Tony. I'm not afraid to go in there, and if it comes to a dare, I will go, although I don't want to be killed. But we can't leave the boat here, that's certain. I'll tell you what to do, said Frank. Let Joe and me go ashore. Then we'll try to follow those men in the boat and see where they go. If we let them slip out of our hands now we may lose them altogether. And shall I wait? No. You go back to Bayport and get help, lots of it. The police. The federal men. Tell them we're on the track of the smugglers. If Joe and I discover anything we'll wait here at the entrance to the cove and put the police on the right track when they get here. Good, said Tony. I'll put you ashore right away. Don't go too close or you'll wreck the boat. Joe, I guess you and I will have to swim ashore. Then we'll go around into the cove and find out all we can. Tony edged the boat in as close to the gloomy shore as he could, and then, with a whispered farewell, the Hardy boys slipped over the side into the water. They were only a few yards from the rocks and after a short swim they emerged, dripping, on the mainland. They looked back. They could see the dim shape of the motorboat as it turned away and then they could hear its dull chugging as Tony Preto turned the craft back in the direction of Bayport. Now, whispered Frank. Now for the smugglers. 16. The Secret Passage. It was very dark. I wish we had a light, whispered Joe. I have a flashlight in my pocket. But we can't use it now. Those men may be still around. Wouldn't the water spoil it? No, I have it in a waterproof case. We can feel our way around these rocks until we get into the cove. Cautiously, the boys made their way along the treacherous rocks. Once Joe lost his footing and slipped into the water with a splash. Instantly both boys remained motionless, fearing the sound had attracted the attention of the men in the cove. But there was not a sound. Joe was ankle-deep in water, but he clambered up on the rocks again and they continued their journey. They had landed at a point some 25 yards away from the entrance to the cove, but the rocks were so treacherous and the journey was so difficult that the distance seemed much longer. "It must be Snackley and his gang, all right," whispered Frank, as they went on through the night. "Didn't you hear one of those men use a Chinese name? He said something about Li Chang's share." Li Chang is probably the fellow who brings the dope to the coast. They bring the stuff into this cove by motorboat and rowboat and it is distributed from here. Dad said Snackley was smuggling dope. It must have been Snackley who ordered us away from here. He seemed like a leader of some kind. $5,000 reward if we lay our hands on him. They had now reached the place where the seemingly solid coastline was broken by the indentation of the cove. They had feared that the cliff might be too steep at this point, but they found that it sloped gradually to the water and that there was a narrow ledge on which they could walk, one behind the other. Here, they realized, the dangerous part of the adventure began. It was very lonely in the shadow of the steep cliffs, and the loneliness was intensified by the distant moaning of the surf and the beat and wash of the waves against the reefs. Far in the distance they could see the reflection of the lights of Bayport through the mist, and once or twice they could hear the murmur of Tony's motorboat as it sped away down the bay. "I hope they bring back lights and guns with them," muttered Frank. "Who?" "The police." "Don't worry. If they get word that Snackley is cornered, they'll send out a squad of militia." The boys rounded the point and began to make their way directly along the shore of the cove. Dense thickets and bushes grew right to the water's edge and the boys were afraid of making too much noise, as they realized that the two men they had heard talking in the boat might be close by, perhaps even waiting to pounce upon them in the darkness. Their hearts beat quickly with the knowledge of the risk they were running, but neither lad thought of turning back. They were not thinking of the smugglers alone, they were thinking of their father. When they reached the first of the thickets they paused. They knew that the crackling of the branches would betray their whereabouts if there was anyone within hearing distance. For a while they did not know just what to do. Then Frank began to lower himself from the rock on which he was standing into the water. "If it isn't too deep we can wade around," he whispered. The water, fortunately, was shallow, and did not come up to his knees. He signaled to Joe to follow, and Joe accordingly slipped quietly down into the water beside him. Then, without a word and moving as slowly as possible, Frank went on, wading through the water, close to the outstretched branches that overhung the shore. It seemed as though they were wading at the bottom of a deep pit, for the high walls of rock ranged all about them, and after they had penetrated into the cove some little distance the entrance was lost to view, being hidden by an angle of the cliffs. When they looked up they could see the gloomy greyness of the night sky above. The cove was still in deep silence, so finally Frank concluded that the men who had entered the place in the boat had retired to some secret hiding place. Inasmuch as they could not hope to discover anything without a light, he withdrew the flashlight from its case, and then switched it on. The yellow beam of light revealed the pallid leaves of the bushes by the shore and the naked walls of rock above. But although Frank turned the flashlight in every direction about the cove, there was no sign of the rowboat in which the two men had arrived. It had vanished utterly. Although the lads were prepared for the disappearance of the smugglers, they were not prepared for the disappearance of the rowboat. But they searched for it in vain. The light revealed nothing of the craft. "I wonder where they hid it," whispered Frank. They began a systematic search of the bushes around the cove, remaining as quiet as possible, but although they made almost a tour of the place, it was soon evident that the boat had not been beached under cover of any of the thickets. It must be hidden in a cave of some kind, Frank decided at last. And that's where the smugglers are. Once again they began a search of the bushes. They were still wading in the water and their feet were now very cold, but they searched patiently and carefully, brushing aside the branches, peering into the bushes, but it seemed they were to find nothing but the uncompromising rocks and moss beyond. At last, however, as they were approaching a part of the cove which they had not visited before, Frank, who was in the lead, stumbled suddenly forward. His groping feet had failed to encounter bottom and he had lost his balance. With great presence of mind, he kept the flashlight high in the air. He had stepped into a deep hole, and although he was up to his neck in water, he kept his arm raised, keeping the flashlight free of the wetness. "Here. Take the light," he gasped, in a hoarse whisper. Joe leaned over and grasped the flashlight. "Deep water here," muttered Frank, as he tried to scramble back into the shallows. But the hole into which he had fallen was a sudden drop, and it was necessary for Joe to grasp his brother's outstretched hand before he could regain the shallow water. At length, soaked to the skin, Frank again stood beside his brother. "Good thing it wasn't any deeper," he remarked. "The bottom is pretty level around here. It's funny there should be a deep hole like that." Frank gave a sudden exclamation. "I know how that came to be there," he whispered. "That's a channel. See how close it is to the shore. The water shouldn't be so deep right there. Why should it be a channel? To let that motorboat get into shore, or the rowboat. They'd run aground otherwise. Give me the light. I'll bet we've found where that boat was hidden." He played the flashlight on the surface of the water and then they could see clearly that the bottom of the cove was broken by a deep channel at that point, several feet in width, leading directly toward a clump of bushes at the shore. Keeping well to the side of the channel and in the shallow water, the Hardy boys made their way over to the bushes. Then, when the beam of the flashlight was cast on the dense covert of branches, the mystery was clear. Beyond the bushes was a dark opening in the rock. "A cave," exclaimed Frank, in a suppressed tone. It was so cleverly concealed that it could not have been seen in the clear light of the day except at close quarters. The glare of the flashlight, however, cast the dark opening into prominence behind the screen of leaves. This, then, was the explanation of the boat's disappearance. There was a channel in the cove enabling the smugglers to row the boat directly into this cave in the rock. This also probably explained the presence of the motorboat. "They went in here," said Joe. "We'll explore it." Having gone so far, there was no going back. The boys were fully determined to keep on the track of the smugglers. They did not know what lay behind the darkness of that silent and mysterious opening in the rock. But they meant to find out, no matter what the risks. Cautiously, they advanced into the bushes, which gave way protestingly before them. The branches whipped their faces. The water was still shallow, for there was a narrow ledge along the side of the channel and, moreover, it was now low tide. At last the bushes closed behind them. The Hardy boys were standing in the entrance to a secret passage, pressed close against the rocky wall of the cave. 17. The chamber in the cliff. Frank switched on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the depths of the dark passage. Far ahead of the brothers they glimpsed a grey shape just above the surface of the glistening water. For a moment they were startled, then they recognized that the grey shape was nothing more than the rowboat that had passed by them in the darkness outside the cove. It had been drawn up close to a natural wharf hewn out of the solid rock. It swayed to and fro with the motion of the water. The boys made their way forward along the ledge, which was wide enough for one person to walk on, until at last the ledge widened out and proved to be a path leading to the wharf. There was not a sound in the passage but the drip-drip of water from the gloomy walls. The Hardy boys stole quietly forward along the wharf, past the boat, and then looked about them. Frank played the beam of the flashlight all about the place until at last the glare revealed a dark opening immediately ahead. It was a crude arch in the rock and beyond it he could see a steep flight of wooden steps. His heart was pounding with excitement. There was no doubt now that they had discovered the smuggler's secret. "We've found it," he whispered to Joe. "We've found the passage. This must be directly underneath the house on the cliff. We'll have to go quietly." The light cast strange shadows through the gloomy passage in the rocks. Water dripped from the walls. Water dripped from their clothing. They tiptoed quietly forward beneath the archway until they reached the flight of steps. Then, quietly, almost stealthily, they began to ascend. The place was in a death-like silence. It was as if they were in a tomb. So quiet was the strange stairway in the cliff that the boys could hardly believe that men had been there but a short while before. Step by step they ascended the stairs, and at last Frank's flashlight showed that they were approaching a door. It was set directly in a frame in the wall of rock at which the stairs ended. The passageway curved above them in a rocky ceiling. They stood on the steps outside the door. Should they enter? They did not know what lay beyond. They might be entering the very haunt of the smugglers. In fact, this was most probable. And in that event they would not have a chance of escape. For a while they remained there, not knowing whether to retreat or go on. Then Frank stepped forward. He pressed his ear against the door and listened intently. There was not a sound. He peered around the sides of the door to see if he could catch a glimpse of light. There was only darkness. At length he decided that there was no one immediately beyond the door and he made up his mind to go ahead. He whispered his decision to Joe, who nodded. "I'm with you." The door was opened by a latch, and Frank tried it cautiously. At first it was obstinate. Then, with an abrupt clatter that echoed from wall to wall and seemed to the ears of the boys to create a hideous and deafening uproar, the latch snapped and the door swung open. They did not immediately cross the threshold. Perhaps their approach had been heard. Perhaps the smugglers lay in wait for them beyond. So they remained there in silence for several minutes, listening for the slightest sound. However, it became apparent that the dark chamber was empty, so Frank switched on the flashlight. The vivid beam cut the darkness and revealed a gloomy cave in the very center of the cliff, hewn out of the rock. It had been a natural cave, just as the tunnel in the cliff had been a natural passageway, but the roof had been bolstered up by great beams and the sides had been chipped away while the floor had been leveled. It was a secret chamber in the heart of the rock. The light revealed the fact that this chamber was used as a storeroom, for there were huge boxes, bales, and packages distributed about the floor and piled against the walls. "Smuggled goods," exclaimed Frank. His suspicions seemed verified by the fact that the majority of the boxes bore labels of foreign countries. Chinese characters were scribbled across them in practically every case. Seeing that the chamber was unoccupied, the boys stepped through the doorway and looked about them. The flashlight illuminated the murky corners of the cave. "This must be where they store all the stuff," Joe said, as he inspected one of the boxes. "There must be another opening that leads to the top of the cliff. They probably bring the stuff up to the house and then dispose of it from there. You'd think they would keep it at the Palukka place instead of down here. Probably they are afraid the house might be raided at some time or another. That's why they keep the goods hidden in this place. It would be mighty hard for anyone to find it here. But how do they get the stuff out of here? There's no doorway that I can see." The light of the flashlight played upon the walls. No doorway, no opening of any kind, was revealed. "That's strange," said Frank. "There must be some way out." They began to move about the chamber. Across some of the bales of goods had been thrown rich bolts of silk, while valuable tapestries were also lying carelessly on the floor. In one corner were 3 or 4 boxes piled on top of one another. Frank accidentally knocked the flashlight against one of these and it gave forth a hollow sound. "It's empty," he said. An idea struck him that perhaps these boxes had been piled up to conceal some passage leading out of the secret chamber. He mentioned his suspicion to Joe. "But how could they pile the boxes up there after they went out?" his brother questioned. "This gang are smart enough for anything. Let's move these boxes away." He seized the topmost box. It was very light and he removed it from the top of the pile without difficulty. "I thought so," exclaimed Frank, with satisfaction. for the light revealed the top of a door which had hitherto been hidden from view. The boys lost no time in moving the rest of the boxes, and the entire door was soon in sight. Then the boys discovered how it was possible for the boxes to be piled up in such a position in spite of the fact that the smugglers had left the chamber and closed the door behind them. Attached to the bottom of the door was a small wooden platform that projected out some distance over the floor of the cave, and on this platform the boxes had been piled. "They are kept there all the time, as a blind," he said. "Whenever anyone leaves the cave and closes the door, the boxes swing in with the platform and it looks as though they were piled up on the floor." The ingenuity of the contrivance won their reluctant admiration. "What shall we do?" asked Joe, looking through the doorway into the darkness beyond. "Go ahead. We've come this far, and there's no sense in turning back. Let's go." Frank stepped on into the passage beyond. He had hardly switched on the flashlight, revealing a crude flight of stairs that led from the rocky landing, before he stiffened and laid a warning hand on his brother's arm. "Voices," he whispered. They listened. They heard a man's voice in the distance. They could not distinguish what he was saying, for he was still too far away, but gradually the tones grew louder. Then, to their alarm, they heard footsteps. Hastily, they retreated into the secret chamber. "Quick! The door!" snapped Frank. They closed the door quietly. "Now the boxes. If they come in here, they'll notice that the boxes have been moved. Quick!" Swiftly the Hardy boys began to pile the empty boxes back on the platform that projected from the bottom of the door. They worked as quietly as possible, and as they worked they heard the footsteps on the stairs drawing closer and closer. Finally, the topmost box was in place. Out the other door. They sped across the floor of the chamber toward the door that led to the stairs they had just recently ascended, but hardly had they reached it before they heard a rattle at the latch of the door on the opposite side of the cave. "We haven't time," whispered Frank. "Hide." The beam of the flashlight revealed a number of boxes close by the door. Over these boxes had been thrown a heavy bolt of silk, the folds of which hung down to the floor. They scrambled swiftly in behind the boxes, pressing themselves close against the wall. They did not have more than time to hide themselves and switch out the light before they heard the other door open. "There's a package of dope in that shipment that came in last night," they heard a husky voice saying. "We'll bring it upstairs, for Burke says he can get rid of it for us right away. No use leaving it down here." "Right," they heard someone else reply. "Anything else to go up?" "No. We won't start moving the rest of this until the end of the week. It's too dangerous. Let Burke take out the shipment he has, along with this dope, and then we'll lay low for a few days. I'm getting a bit nervous." "What does the big boss think about it?" "That's his idea too. Here, wait till I switch on that light." There was a click, and suddenly the chamber was flooded with light. The cave had been wired for electricity. The Hardy boys crouched in their hiding place. Their hearts were pounding madly. Would they be discovered? Footsteps slowly approached the boxes behind which they were concealed. 18. A startling discovery. The Hardy boys were tense with a realization of their peril. The strong electric light that hung from the center of the ceiling cast such a vivid illumination that they were sure they would be seen, particularly when they found that the boxes behind which they were hidden were spaced some distance apart. But for the folds of silk that hung down over the opening, they would certainly have been seen. "Here's some of that special silk," they heard the first man say. "Perhaps I'd better bring it up too. Burke was saying he could handle some more silk." "We're done for," thought Frank. "If he ever comes close enough to pick up that silk he'll see us, sure." But the other man objected. "What's the use? You won't get any more thanks for carrying all that stuff upstairs, even if Burke does take it. And if he doesn't, you'll just have to cart it all the way down again. My motto in this gang is to do just what Snackley tells me and no more." "I guess you're right. We'll just bring up the dope." To the relief of the boys, the man turned away and went back to the other side of the chamber. They could hear a rustling sound. Then came the words. "Well, we've got it. Let's go back up." The switch snapped and the cavern was steeped in darkness immediately. It was a darkness immeasurably welcome to the lads crouched behind the boxes. They began to breathe more easily. They heard the door close and then they could hear the footsteps of the two men as they ascended the stairs in the passageway. When the footsteps could be heard no more, Frank switched on the flashlight with a sigh of relief. That was a close call. Gosh, but I was sure they had us. We wouldn't have had any chance with that pair. You can bet your life they carry guns. Well, let's follow them. I'm with you. We know we're on the right track. And we know we're liable to blunder right into the whole den of smugglers if we don't watch our step. It's going to be ticklish from now on. It can't be any more ticklish than it has been. I lived about 10 years while that pair was in here. They crossed the chamber and again opened the door. Cautiously, they stepped out on the landing, closed the door behind them, and again confronted the flight of steps. I'll go first, said Frank. Stick close behind me. He decided to turn out the flashlight, because it was barely possible that the smugglers might have a guard at the top of the stairs, in which event their approach would be discovered. So, in the inky blackness, they ascended, step after step. They reached the top of the first flight of stairs and then they found themselves upon a crude landing of planks which ran along the side of the rock wall for some distance until it ended in another flight of steps. Here the boys stopped again to listen. All was as silent as the tomb save for the distant pounding of the sea upon the cliff. I don't hear a sound, whispered Joe. Come on, came from his brother. The passage through the rock was of considerable depth, and they went on up countless steps until their limbs were weary. They had never realized that the cliff was so high until now. But at length they reached the final landing and there they were confronted by another door. This door, they assumed, either led out into the open or into some cave just below the surface of the ground. Perhaps, thought Frank, it even led into the cellar of the Palukka house. The boys pressed close to the door, taking care to make no noise, and listened. They heard not a sound. Still, with the caution arising from their previous narrow escape, they decided to wait a little while longer. As later events proved, it was well that they did. For a while they could hear nothing from beyond the door and there was no indication that anyone was there. But, after listening intently for as long as 5 minutes, they heard a queer shuffling sound and then a sigh. That was all. Someone there, breathed Frank, in a low whisper. Joe nodded in the darkness. They did not know what to do. It seemed apparent that there was someone beyond the door. Possibly a sentry. If there was only one man it might be possible to attack him and disarm him, although it was scarcely possible that they could do this without noise and without attracting the attention of the smugglers. The problem was solved for them. A door thudded in the distance. Then there was a muffled murmur of voices, growing in volume, and a trampling of feet. I tell you this nonsense has gone far enough. He'll sign, and he'll sign right now, or I'll know the reason why. The boys started. For the voice was none other than the voice of the man who had ordered them out of the cove that afternoon. That's the stuff, Chief, returned someone. Make him sign and promise to keep his mouth shut. If he doesn't he'll never live to tell about it, that's one thing sure, snapped the first man coldly. There was the sound of a switch being snapped, and then the boys could see a yellow beam of light beneath the door at their feet. From the sounds they judged that 3 or 4 men had entered the room beyond. Well, he's still here, said the man who had been addressed as Chief. He strode across the room and the boys could hear a chair scrape on the board floor. You'll find that this is an easier place to get into than it is to get out of. A weary voice answered him. The tones were low. The boys could not make out the words. You're a prisoner here and you'll be a prisoner here until you die unless you sign that paper. Again the weary voice spoke, but, as before, the tones were so low that the words were indistinguishable. You won't sign, eh? We'll see about that. Wait till he goes hungry for a few days and then he'll think differently, put in one of the other men. There was a hoarse laugh from his companions. Yes, you'll be hungry enough before we're through with you. I can promise you that, said the harsh voice. Are you going to sign? No, They heard the prisoner in the other room answer. Who was this man who was evidently held captive by the smugglers in the underground room? The same thought was in the mind of each boy as he listened to the conversation. You know too much about us. You've found out too much, and we'll never let you get out of here to use your information. You may as well get that straight. You've read that paper. If you don't sign it, you will starve. The prisoner evidently did not reply. Give him a taste of the hot iron, suggested one of the smugglers. No, nothing like that. It's too crude. I'm giving him his chance. He can sign this paper now or take the consequences. Still there was no reply. Getting obstinate, are you? Won't you even answer me? The leader of the gang was evidently getting angry. Suddenly he shouted out. Sign this paper, Hardy, or you'll starve as sure as my name is Snackley. 19. Captured. The worst fears of the Hardy boys were realized. They had been unable to distinguish clearly the voice of the prisoner until then, for it had been muffled by the intervening door, but all along they had suspected that it was their father. Now they knew, and they knew also that he was a captive of Snackley, the head of the gang of smugglers. Joe gave a perceptible start, but Frank laid a warning hand upon his brother's arm. Now, of all times, there was need for caution. They listened. I won't sign it, replied Fenton Hardy clearly. Snackley replied. You heard what I said. Sign or starve. I'll starve. You'll think differently in a day or so. You're pretty hungry now, Hardy, but you'll be a lot hungrier later on. And thirsty, too. You'll be ready to sell your soul for a drop of water or a bite to eat. I won't sign. After all, we're not asking very much. You've discovered a number of things that we want you to forget about. It won't hurt you to go back to Bayport and say that you couldn't find out anything about us. Nobody knows where you have been. I've found out all I wanted to know about you, Snackley. I've got enough evidence to send you to the penitentiary for the rest of your life. And I have more than that. What do you mean, more than that? I know enough to have you sent to the electric chair. There was a sudden commotion in the room and 2 or 3 of the smugglers began talking at once. You're crazy, shouted Snackley, but there was a current of uneasiness in his voice. You're crazy. You don't know anything about me. I know enough to have you sent up for murder. All the more reason why you're not going to get out of here without signing this paper. You can count yourself lucky you have even this chance of getting out alive. By all rights we should knock you on the head and heave you over the cliff into the sea. I won't sign. Don't be foolish. All we ask you to do is to agree that you won't make use of the information you have. I admit that you've stumbled on some of our secrets, and we can't afford to turn you loose and have the federal agents about our ears in no time. You must trust me very much. What is to prevent me from signing that paper and then going back on my word? Asked Fenton Hardy curiously. We know you too well, Hardy. We know that if you signed that promise you would keep it. Exactly. And that is why I won't sign it. I wouldn't be doing my duty if I agreed to any scheme that would protect you. How about your family? Are you doing your duty to them by being so obstinate? There was silence for a while. Then Fenton Hardy answered slowly. They would rather know that I died doing my duty than have me come back to them as a protector of smugglers and criminals. You have a very high sense of duty, sneered Snackley. But perhaps you'll think better of it after a while. Are you thirsty? There was no reply. Are you hungry? Still no answer. You know you are. And you'll be hungrier and thirstier before we are through with you. We'll put food and water in your sight, but you won't be able to reach it. You'll die of thirst and starvation unless you sign that paper. I'll never sign it. All right. Come on, men. We'll leave him to himself and give him time to think about it." Footsteps resounded as Snackley and the others began to leave the room, and finally they died away and a door banged. Fenton Hardy was left alone. Joe made a sudden move toward the door, but Frank restrained him. "Not just yet," he cautioned. "They may have left someone to guard him." So the boys waited, listening intently at the door. But there were no further sounds from within the room. At length, satisfied that his father had indeed been left alone, Frank fumbled for the latch of the door. Noiselessly, he managed to open it. He pressed in on the door until it was open about an inch, then he peeped through the aperture. He found himself on the threshold of a sort of cellar, a damp and mouldy chamber, of about the same size as the storage room in the heart of the cliff, with the difference that whereas the first room was a cave in the rock, this place had been dug out of the earth. It was floored with planks, and a lone electric light cast a yellowish illumination over the scene. There was a crude table and a few chairs, while in one corner stood a small camp bed. On this bed he spied his father. Fenton Hardy was bound hand and foot to the cot, so tightly trussed up that he was unable to move more than a few inches in any direction. He was lying flat on his back, staring up at the muddy ceiling of his prison. On a chair beside the cot was a large sheet of paper, presumably the document the smugglers were asking him to sign. The detective did not hear the door open. As Frank looked at him, he was conscious of a change in the appearance of his father, a change that shocked him extremely. For Fenton Hardy was thin and pale, his cheeks were sunken, and he looked like a man who was famished for want of food. Frank opened the door a little wider and tiptoed into the room. Joe followed quietly. They knew that there was danger of the smugglers returning at any moment. They knew that they must work swiftly and quietly if they were to effect the release of their father. A slight sound attracted Fenton Hardy's attention, and he slowly turned his head. When his gaze rested on the figures of the two boys who were stealing across the floor toward him, he almost uttered an exclamation of amazement, but he managed to check the involuntary utterance, although his face lighted up with relief. Quickly, the Hardy boys reached his bedside. Frank drew out his pocket-knife and, without a word, without even a whisper, began to hack at the ropes that bound his father. But the knife was dull and the ropes were heavy. Joe had lost his knife in the water soon after they had left Bayport, and although he searched about the room, he was unable to find one, so he set himself to the laborious business of trying to untie the knots. Every moment was precious. At any second, the boys knew, they might hear the footsteps of the approaching smugglers. They worked with frantic caution, working against time. Frank hacked at the ropes, but the dull blade seemed to make little progress. Joe fumbled at the obstinate knots until his fingernails were broken, but he could scarcely loosen the strands. Minutes passed slowly and agonizingly. Fenton Hardy could give no assistance. He had to lie there in silence, not daring even to encourage the lads by a whisper. The silence was broken only by the heavy breathing of the two boys, by the scarcely audible sound of the knife against the ropes. At last the knife cut through one of the ropes and Fenton Hardy's feet were free. Frank pulled the ropes away, but a loose end fell on the floor with a light sound. Slight as the noise was, it seemed to them almost deafening, in view of the necessity for silence. Desperately, Frank prepared to set to work to cut through the ropes that bound Fenton Hardy's arms. And, even as he reached over with the knife, they heard a sound that sent a thrill of terror through them. It was a heavy footstep beyond the door through which the smugglers had recently disappeared. Someone was approaching the underground room. Frank strained at the knife, but the ropes were stubborn. The dull blade made little impression at first. But at last the rope began to give, and finally, as Fenton Hardy gave a mighty effort, it snapped, and the detective was free. But the footsteps on the stairs had drawn nearer and it was followed by others. The smugglers were returning. "Quick," whispered Frank, as he flung the ropes aside. I can't, hurry, gasped out Fenton Hardy. I've been here too long. He could hardly utter the words. His face showed his exhaustion. But we've got to hurry, Dad, came excitedly from Frank. See if you can't make it. I'll do my best, returned his father. If those fellows come back, let's fight for it, put in Joe desperately. You bet we'll fight, answered Frank in a voice that meant a great deal. Fenton Hardy got to his feet as hastily as he could, but when he stood up on the floor he reeled and would have fallen had not Joe grasped his arm. He had been lying bound to the cot for so long and he was so weak from hunger that a fit of dizziness had attacked him. It soon passed, however, and the three hastened toward the door through which the Hardy boys had entered. But the smugglers were very close now. The Hardys could hear the coarse voices just outside the other door. There was no chance of escape. Just as the Hardy boys and their father crossed the threshold, the door on the opposite side of the room was flung open. Frank had a confused glimpse of the dark man, Snackley, whom they had seen in the cove that afternoon, with half a dozen rough men crowding behind him. Then he saw Snackley whip a revolver from his pocket. The chief of the smugglers was filled with astonishment, but he did not lose his presence of mind. The weapon was leveled at Frank before he had time to close the door. Snackley did not speak. He pressed the trigger and the revolver roared, the echoes crowding on one another in that narrow space. The bullet chipped into the wood of the door. Frank ducked. Joe, who was in the lead, flung himself to one side. Fenton Hardy stumbled out onto the landing at the top of the stairs. Come back, roared Snackley, plunging across the room. Come back or I'll fire again. As the smuggler drew closer, Frank crouched for a spring, and then leaped directly at Snackley. He struck out at the man's wrist and the revolver flew out of the rascal's grasp, skidding across the floor into a corner. Then they grappled, and so sudden had been Frank's attack that the smuggler was taken by surprise and he reeled up against the wall. But his companions rushed to his rescue. Frank was swiftly overpowered and dragged away, while other smugglers, with drawn revolvers, pursued Joe and Fenton Hardy out onto the landing. Being unarmed, they were forced to submit, otherwise they would have been shot without mercy. The struggle was short. The menacing revolvers gave the smugglers the upper hand. Within 5 minutes Fenton Hardy was bound to the cot again while the Hardy boys were seated, trussed up and unable to move, on 2 chairs nearby. They were captives of the smugglers. XX. Dire threats. Snackley, once he had recovered from his first consternation and surprise, was in high humor. Just in time, he chuckled, rubbing his hands with satisfaction. Just in time. If we'd been a few minutes later they'd have been away from us altogether. The Hardy boys were silent. They were sick with disappointment. It had seemed that escape was certain, and then, in a twinkling, the tables had been turned and now they were all worse off than they had been before. What will we do with them, Chief? Asked one of the men. The voice sounded familiar to the boys and they looked up. Not altogether to their surprise, they saw that the fellow was none other than Redhead, whom they had seen at the Palooka place the day Frank discovered his father's cap. Do with them, exclaimed Snackley. That's quite a problem. We have 3 on our hands now, where we had only 1. We have to make 3 people keep their mouths shut instead of only 1. We have 3 people to keep guard over now. We ought to do what I wanted to do in the first place, declared Redhead doggedly. As long as Hardy is alive, he's dangerous. You mean we should get rid of him? Sure, we ought to get rid of him and get rid of those boys of his, too. That's easier said than done, returned Snackley, but with a sinister look at the man on the cot. I should think you had enough on your conscience already, Snackley, exclaimed Fenton Hardy. But I suppose you're hardened enough for anything, he added bitterly. He was thinking more of his sons and their possible fate than of himself. Don't you bother about my conscience, sneered Snackley, but a shadow crossed his face. What do you know about me, anyhow? He demanded roughly. I know all about what happened to Felix Palooka. He had a big treasure hidden in that house on the cliff and you got it, and then you started to use the place for your smuggling operations. Oh, shut up. Snackley snapped. I'm going to fix you, and those kids of yours, too. Just wait and see. 4 of the smugglers had been whispering among themselves at the back of the room during this talk between the chief smuggler and the detective, and now one of these men stepped forward. Got a word to say to you, Chief, he began, addressing Snackley. What is it now? The chief smuggler's voice was surly. It's about what's to be done with these 3, now we have 'em prisoners, returned the man hesitatingly. Of course, your business is your own and we're not asking any questions about what happened to Felix Pallucca, but we're in this game of smuggling, see? We don't stand for anything that's too red-handed. That's the truth, put in another of the men. Kind of chicken-hearted, sneered Snackley. You look out or I'll fire the lot of you. No, you won't, Chief, replied the first man who had addressed him. We've helped in this smuggling, and we're going to have our full share of what's coming to us. We've got another plan about those 3 prisoners, put in a fellow who had not yet spoken. I think it would work out grand. What plan? Questioned the chief smuggler briefly. We've been talking about Li Chang. What about him? Turn him over to Li Chang. He's sailing back to China in the morning. Have him put on board his ship. Snackley scratched his head for a moment. Evidently the idea caught his fancy. Not bad, he muttered. I hadn't thought of Li Chang. Yes, he'd be able to look after them. He'd see to it that they never returned, and he grinned grimly. He'd probably dump them overboard before they got to China at all, declared Redhead smugly. Li Chang doesn't like to feed passengers if they can be got rid of. So much the better. We won't be responsible. Leave it to Li Chang. The old villain would just like to have 3 white men in his power. He'll attend to them. Snackley reached over and picked up the document from the floor, where it had fallen in the struggle. He glanced at it and then tore it into pieces. We won't need this. You've lost your chance, Hardy. If you had signed it you would have been free by now. But you'll never be free, not with 3 of you knowing our secret. It's too risky. You'll all be turned over to Li Chang. He brought in a little cargo this week and his ship is to sail in the morning. You will go with him. Fenton Hardy was silent. He had resolved not to plead for his own safety. Well, said Snackley, haven't you anything to say? Nothing. Do as you wish with me. But let the boys go. We'll stick with you, Dad, said Frank quickly. We sure will, added Joe. You certainly will, declared Snackley. I'm not going to let one of you have the chance of getting back to Bayport with your story. The chief of the smugglers stood in the center of the room for a while, contemplating his captives with a bitter smile. Then he turned suddenly on his heel. Well, they're safe enough, he said to Redhead. We have that business with Burke to attend to. You two, he said, speaking to 2 of his men, had better go down to the cove and take the rowboat out. Signal to Li Chang that we need the motorboat sent in at once. The rest of you come and help load Burke's truck. If any nosy policeman came along and found it in the lane we'd be done for. How about them? Asked Redhead, indicating the prisoners. They're safe enough. But I guess we'd better leave one guard, anyway. Malloy, you stay here and keep watch. Malloy, a surly and truculent fellow in overalls and a ragged sweater, nodded and sat down on a box near the door. This arrangement seemed to satisfy Snackley, and after warning Malloy not to fall asleep on the job and to see to it that the prisoners did not escape, he left the room, followed by Redhead and the other smugglers, with the exception of 2 who left by the other door. Their footsteps could be heard as they went down the flight of stairs leading to the bottom of the cliff. A heavy silence fell over the room after the departure of the smugglers. Malloy crouched gloomily on the box, gazing blankly at the floor. The butt of a revolver projected from his hip pocket. Frank strained against the ropes that bound him to the chair. But the smugglers had done their task well. He could scarcely budge. We're done for, I guess, he heard Joe say. Frank seldom gave up heart, but this time he could see no ray of hope. I'm afraid so. Looks as if we'd be with Li Chang by morning. But we don't want to go to China, Frank. We may never get to China, Joe. Didn't you hear what they said? For all we know, that rascally Chinaman, whoever he is, may heave us overboard when he gets well out in the ocean." "You fellows shut up," growled Malloy. "Shut up, I tell you, or I'll make it hot for you," and he tapped his revolver suggestively. After that an ominous silence fell between the prisoners. Frank and Joe were downhearted. It looked as if their fate was sealed. XXI, quick work. The Hardy boys glanced over at their father on the cot. To their surprise they saw that he was smiling. Frank was on the point of asking him what he found in the situation to smile at when he caught a warning glance. He looked over at the guard. Malloy was not bothering with the prisoners. He was not even looking in their direction. Instead, his head was already beginning to nod, as though he were going to sleep. Snackley had made a poor selection when he chose Malloy as guard. The man had been up the entire previous night helping bring in the shipment of smuggled goods from Li Chang's vessel, and he had had no sleep that day. He was very tired. Sleep stole upon him without his being aware of it. Several times he straightened up and rubbed his eyes, but eventually he would bow his head again and give in to the luxury of a little doze. In the meantime, Mr. Hardy was busy. He had profited by his previous experience. When the smugglers seized him and attempted to tie him to the bed for the second time, he had made use of a trick frequently employed by magicians and professional escape artists, who guarantee to escape from ropes and straitjackets. He had expanded his chest and held his muscles rigid, keeping his arms as far away from his sides as possible, so that later, when he relaxed, he found that the ropes did not bind him as tightly as his captors had intended. This gave him a small leeway. He found that the ropes were especially slack about his right wrist, so he began to work laboriously to free himself. For a long time he thought it would be impossible, and the rope chafed his wrist, but at last he managed to slide his hand free. Joe and Frank watched this performance with amazement, and new hope came into their eyes as they saw their father slowly groping for one of the knots. The detective fumbled at it for a while. It was slow work, for he had but one hand free, but in their haste the smugglers had not tied the knot as firmly as they should, and before long Fenton Hardy had loosened it to such an extent that soon the ends of the rope fell away. His arms were now free, so he braced himself against the sides of the bed and struggled to release his feet. They had not been bound so securely, being simply tied down under one strand of rope about the cot, and after silently struggling for a few minutes he was able to work his way free. The detective's next move was to take off his boots, which he did swiftly and quietly, placing them noiselessly on the bed. Then he crept out onto the floor and began to steal over toward the guard. Malloy was half asleep, but the detective had not gone more than 2 yards before a slight sound, a slight creaking of the floor, warned the guard that something was amiss. He turned, blinking. A look of intense amazement crossed Malloy's face and he opened his mouth to yell for help, but Fenton Hardy leaped across the intervening space and hurled himself upon the smuggler before the guard had time to utter more than a muffled gasp. He clapped one hand over Malloy's mouth and bore the guard to the floor, where they rolled over and over in a desperate and silent struggle. Although Fenton Hardy was weakened by his imprisonment and privation, and although the smuggler was strong and wiry, the detective had the advantage of a surprise attack, and Malloy had no time to collect his faculties. Joe and Frank watched the battle in an agony of suspense. It was, they knew, their last hope. Fenton Hardy still kept his hand over the other man's mouth, although Malloy was gasping and gurgling and making frantic efforts to call out for help. The detective dug his knee into Malloy's stomach, and when the smuggler tried to wriggle out of the way he snatched for the revolver. Their hands closed about the butt of the weapon at the same instant. The struggle was short and bitter. Malloy tugged at the revolver, trying to draw it from his pocket. Fenton Hardy dug his knee sharply against the man and Malloy loosened his grasp, with a groan of pain. The detective snatched the revolver free and then flung himself back, leveling the weapon at Malloy. "Not a word out of you," he whispered. Malloy's hands rose in the air. He did not utter a sound. He was sitting helplessly on the floor, his mouth opening and closing as he painfully drew breath. He was beaten. The detective spied a knife in a leather sheath at the smuggler's belt, so he reached forward and seized the weapon. Then, still keeping Malloy covered with the revolver, he walked slowly backward until he reached Joe's side. Without removing his eyes from the smuggler, Fenton Hardy bent down and sliced at the ropes that bound his son. The knife was sharp and the ropes soon fell apart. Joe leaped from the chair, casting aside the rope ends, and took the proffered knife. Then, while his father still covered Malloy, he went over to Frank and set him free. Still without saying a word, Fenton Hardy motioned toward the bed and indicated by signs that the smuggler was to lie down on the cot. A gesture of refusal on the part of Malloy was met by a vigorous forward thrust of the revolver, and the smuggler hastily retreated. The ropes on the bed had not been cut, so they were still available for trussing up Malloy just as Mr. Hardy had been bound. The boys did the job with neatness and dispatch, and they even gagged the smuggler with his own handkerchief and one of the ropes from the chairs. Within 5 minutes their erstwhile guard was lying helpless on the bed, bound hand and foot and gagged so firmly that only a muffled and subdued muttering escaped him. "What now?" asked Frank, in a low tone. "We can't go out by the cove," replied his father. "There are 2 men down there now signaling to the motorboat. We'd better go upstairs." "Where does that lead to?" "Outside. It will bring us into the shed near the house." Fenton Hardy moved over toward the door. "We haven't any time to lose," he said. "I have the revolver. If we meet anyone." He opened the door cautiously and peeped out. There was no one beyond. There was nothing but a flight of steps leading upward into darkness. The detective went forward, his sons following close at his heels. Step by step they made their way on up in the darkness, for Joe had closed the door behind them and Frank did not dare make use of the flashlight. At last Fenton Hardy came to a stop. He was fumbling at something immediately above. Then the boys saw a faint opening which grew larger above them and resolved itself into a square of grey light against which the head and shoulders of their father were fully silhouetted. Fenton Hardy had raised the trapdoor that concealed the entrance to the underground caves and passages. Mr. Hardy looked out carefully. There was no sign of the smugglers. He proceeded to the very top of the steps, then moved clear of the stairway. Frank and Joe followed, rising out of the ground like mysterious spirits of the earth, and the 3 stood in the shelter of the shed. It was a dark night and the trees were moaning in the wind from the sea. Immediately before them rose the gloomy mass of the house on the cliff. There were no lights. In the direction of the lane they could hear dull sounds, no doubt from the truck that the smugglers were loading with goods which were to be disposed of by the man called Burke. "Safe so far," whispered the detective to his sons. They moved out of the shed, after closing the trapdoor, and stood in the shadows. "We can't go by way of the lane," whispered Frank. "There's a prisoner in the cellar of that house," said Fenton Hardy. "I hate to go without setting him free." "A prisoner?" "I heard them talking about him." "Why can't we go to town for help?" "Once they find us gone they'll clear out." "But 3 of us can't do much against this gang. They'll just capture us all again." The detective considered this for a moment. At last he sighed. "Yes, the risk is too great," he said. "And I've let you take too many risks already. We'd better go back to town." Having arrived at this decision, they moved slowly across the grass of the yard, heading toward the bushes that flanked the lane. The great bulk of the old stone house loomed heavily and darkly in the night. Then, suddenly, they heard a harsh sound that struck terror into their hearts, the clatter of the trapdoor being raised. XXII, into the haunted house. A hoarse shout came through the darkness. "Chief! Redhead! They've got away! Watch for 'em!" Someone was scrambling through the opening in the shed, bellowing in a frantic voice, warning the other smugglers of the escape. "Into the house," snapped Fenton Hardy. He began to run swiftly across the yard toward the big gloomy house. Frank and Joe followed. The man in the shed saw the moving figures. The darkness was pierced by a flash of crimson and a revolver barked 3 times. From the lane came sounds of running feet. A man was shouting. "What is it? What's the matter?" "They've got away. Hardy and them boys. They've escaped. Look. There they are now, running across the yard." The revolver spoke again. But the shots were wild, for the detective and his sons were soon lost to view in the shadows of the house. With the uproar growing in volume behind them, they fled for the shelter of the building. It was their only refuge. If they attempted to escape to the road, they would be almost certain of meeting some of the smugglers. They could not go back down the passageway. If they retreated, they would be driven to the verge of the cliff. Fenton Hardy sped around to the back door and flung it open. The fugitives raced into the kitchen and closed the door behind them. Out of the darkness came a frightened voice. "Who's there?" It was so sudden and unexpected that their pulses leaped. They made no answer. "Who's there, I say? Is it you, redhead?" Still they did not reply. Fenton Hardy crept through the darkness in the direction of the voice. "Speak, quick. Speak, or I'll fire." The boys heard a sudden, scrambling sound. Their father had thrown himself upon the other man. The boys rushed in on the 2 struggling figures. There was a deafening roar and a streak of flame. The man of the house had been armed with a shotgun, and in the struggle it had exploded. Fortunately, the Hardy boys were not standing in the path of the shot. But the noise had attracted the attention of the smugglers outside the house, and in a few seconds the back door was flung open. "They're in here," someone yelled. "They're in the house." Fenton Hardy flung to one side the man with whom he had been struggling. Upstairs, he called out to the 2 boys and ran on into the next room. A feeble light was burning, a candle standing in its own grease near the bottom of the staircase. Up these stairs they fled, Joe pausing long enough to extinguish the candle. The room was plunged into darkness just as the first of the smugglers rushed through the doorway. Fenton Hardy waited at the top of the stairs until the boys joined him. Somebody in the room below lit a match. The detective fired directly at the spluttering light. There was a muttered exclamation. The match was immediately extinguished by the smuggler who had been so incautious as to reveal his whereabouts in this manner. A whispered conversation followed. "He's at the top of the stairs," said one of the smugglers. "We can't rush him. He's got a revolver." "Only one?" "Yes. The kids aren't armed." "Wait till he uses up his ammunition. Then we'll get him." There was another whispered colloquy and then the smugglers apparently withdrew toward the doorway leading into the kitchen. Then, in a moment, a perfect fusillade of shots broke out. But Fenton Hardy and the boys had withdrawn past the turn in the staircase and were well protected. They could hear the uproar of gunfire as the smugglers riddled the staircase with bullets. "That should have finished them," they could hear Snackley saying. "If they're on the stairs at all, they're as dead as mutton by now." "Best be careful," muttered one of the men. Hardy has a gun. Where did he get it? From the guard. They tied him up. Lucky they didn't get away altogether. Wait till I talk to Malloy. He was tied fast to the bed when we came back up the stairs. They had taken his gun and gagged him. He said they had just gone, so we made after them and came up through the trapdoor. They were just getting out of the shed when we saw em. What a fine chase we would have had if they had got out into the woods. Well, we have em trapped now. Whispers followed. The boys listened. Once they heard someone say, "The back stairs." Frank turned to his father. "They're going to rush us by the back stairs." "I hadn't thought of that," said Mr. Hardy. "I wonder if there is any way of reaching the attic." Frank took the flashlight from his pocket and switched it on. Just a few yards away he could distinguish a flight of stairs leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. At the same time he could hear a stealthy noise at the bottom of another flight of steps that led to the kitchen. "Hurry," he whispered, and the three moved silently down the hall until they reached the steps. Joe went up first and Frank followed with the light, while Fenton Hardy stood at the bottom of the steps to cover their retreat with the revolver. When Joe reached the trapdoor he pushed at it. At first it proved stubborn and would not open. There was an anxious moment while he strove to force it open, but in spite of all his efforts it would not budge. "What's the matter?" asked Frank from below. "It won't open." Frank went on up the few remaining steps and added his efforts to those of his brother. Together they shoved at the trapdoor, and at last it moved, then opened, falling back with a loud crash. There was a yell from the stairs. "Hurry up, men! They're getting into the attic." A rush of thudding footsteps followed as the smugglers raced up the steps. Joe scrambled through the opening and Frank followed. Fenton Hardy was only halfway up the steps, however, when the first smugglers reached the hallway. The detective fired directly at them. The smugglers who were in the lead fell back in a desperate attempt to reach cover, and in so doing they collided with those behind. For a few moments confusion prevailed, and Fenton Hardy took advantage of it to spring up the few remaining steps, scramble through the opening and fling the trapdoor back into place. The Hardys found themselves in the inky darkness of the attic. Frank switched on the flashlight, and in its glare they saw that they were in a dusty chamber immediately below the roof. Old boxes and rubbish lay about. "Where did they go?" they heard one of the smugglers ask. "Into the attic," replied another. "Now we've got them where we want them." "That's what you said last time." "They can't get out of there. We've got them cornered." Snackley's voice broke in. "Hardy," he shouted. Mr. Hardy did not answer. "Listen, Hardy," went on Snackley. "We'll give you 1 minute to come down out of there." Still no answer. "The floors are thin, Hardy. We can fire right through 'em. You can't get out. We have you cornered. Better come down." Frank flashed the light from side to side. It was evident that the smuggler spoke the truth. They were indeed cornered. An interval of silence followed. Then came, "Your last chance, Hardy." Frank flashed the light upon his father. Mr. Hardy was inspecting the chamber of the revolver. He held out the weapon with a gesture of despair. There were no more shells. A shot sounded from below and a bullet ripped its way savagely through the flooring but a foot or so away from where the three sat. Another bullet tore through the wood of the trapdoor. The Hardys sprang back and, making as little noise as possible, pressed themselves against the sloping walls of the attic, keeping as far away from the trapdoor as they could. A few more shots resounded. The bullets were unpleasantly close. Then Snackley spoke again. "What do you think of it now, Hardy? Are you and your boys ready to come down?" They did not answer, for they knew that if they did their voices would reveal where they were standing and might bring a bullet. When they did not reply, Snackley spoke to his men. "Let 'em have a few more." An angry chorus of revolver shots followed. In the midst of the uproar, some of the smugglers secured a long pole and pushed against the trapdoor with it. Before those above could avert the danger, the trapdoor was flung wide open. It fell back with a crash. A hand appeared through the trapdoor, holding a revolver, and then the head and shoulders of one of the smugglers followed. He peered into the darkness, holding the weapon in readiness. Someone had switched on a light in the hall so that the man's figure could be clearly seen. "Come out of it," he snapped, pointing the revolver directly at the dim figure of Frank. "Come out of it, or I'll shoot." Further resistance was useless. With sinking heart, Frank advanced toward the edge of the opening in the floor, while Joe and Fenton Hardy followed, with arms upraised. The smuggler backed his way down the steps, still keeping them covered, until he reached the bottom of the stairs. The Hardys descended, conscious of an array of leveled revolvers that covered every movement. They saw Snackley standing in the forefront of the crowd. They were captured again. 23. Rescue. Snackley stepped forward. "So," he sneered. "You pretty nearly got away with it, didn't you?" The captives did not answer. They were sick with disappointment. Just when escape had been within their grasp, the smugglers had outwitted them. "You bit off a little more than you could chew when you stacked up against me," bragged Snackley. "What'll we do with them, Chief?" asked one of the men. "Take them back to the cave. We'll get them out to Lee Chang right away. If they get away again, there'll be trouble for you. Keep an eye on them." "Shouldn't we tie them up?" "There's no rope." "It doesn't matter. Put a bullet through the first one that makes a false move. You hear that?" he said, turning to Fenton Hardy. "The first one that tries to escape gets a bullet through him." The three were surrounded by the smugglers. The light shone on their evil, bearded faces and glittered on the drawn revolvers. Fenton Hardy's useless weapon had been snatched from him. "Downstairs," snapped Snackley. "Get downstairs with you." He prodded Frank with the barrel of his revolver as he spoke. The Hardy boys moved toward the stairs, their father in the rear. One of the smugglers went ahead in case the prisoners should by chance make some desperate break for freedom. When they reached the lower room, they paused while the man ahead lit a match. The electric light had been broken. Hardly had the match flared than there came the sound of thudding feet through the kitchen and the back door banged noisily. Someone rushed into the room, gasping for breath. The light revealed him to be another of the smugglers. "Police!" he exclaimed, in terror. "They're coming down the lane." A babel of voices followed. The smugglers came tumbling down the stairs in their haste. With one bound, Snackley leaped forward and seized the man by the collar. "What?" he exclaimed. "What's that you say?" "Police." "Down the lane," gasped the man. "They came down the road in a car and they're closing in on the house. I saw them." With a yell, Snackley flung the man to one side. "Down into the cave," he roared. "Quick!" Confusion prevailed. In the resulting uproar, the match went out and the room was plunged into darkness. Frank resolved on a daring move. He was standing directly beside one of the smugglers, and as soon as the light went out he sprang at the fellow, dashing the revolver from his grasp. It clattered on the floor. "Help!" roared the fellow, as they grappled together. Fenton Hardy had also been watching for his chance, and he sprang through the darkness at Snackley. He collided heavily with the chief of the smugglers and they rolled on the floor in a desperate struggle. It was impossible to distinguish friend from enemy in the darkness. Joe plunged into the midst of the surging figures and his fist smashed against the face of one of the smugglers, who gave a howl of pain. Then, outside the house, another uproar burst forth. Someone was banging on the front door. Men could be heard shouting to one another. Snackley made a desperate effort and managed to get to his feet. He struck out with both fists and managed to break free from the detective. He whirled to one side, stumbled out into the kitchen, and then reached the back door. He flung the door open. Almost instantly a dark figure appeared in the doorway. It was the figure of a man in the uniform of a state trooper with drawn revolver, and Snackley shouted the warning to the smugglers in the other room. "The police," he roared. "Every man for himself. Make your getaway." The trooper shot through the doorway at him, but Snackley dodged to one side. There was a rush of footsteps from the other room as the rest of the smugglers raced out into the kitchen. The officers tried to hold them back, but they were too many for him and he was hurled against the wall. Utter confusion prevailed. The place was in absolute darkness, and out in the yard shots, shouts, and hoarse imprecations mingled in an indescribable uproar. One of the smugglers managed to reach the shed. He flung open the trapdoor and descended the steps. Some of his companions followed, and in the darkness and excitement their escape was unnoticed. Half a dozen police officers were in the yard. They had been attracted to the house by the sound of the shots when the Hardys were pursued by the smugglers, and they had planned to surround the place. They would have succeeded in capturing the entire gang had it not been for the man on guard outside. Back in the living room of the house, Frank was still struggling with his antagonist. The man was strong and heavy, a rough-and-tumble fighter, and the boy soon found that he had his hands full. They struggled desperately in the darkness, the smuggler frantic with the fear of capture. Frank grimly resolved that the man should not get away. Fenton Hardy headed toward the door leading into the kitchen. Just then a figure brushed by him. He made a grab for the man, but the fellow evaded him and raced toward the other side of the room. The detective gave chase. The fugitive kicked open a door and ran toward the front of the house. Mr. Hardy could follow him quite easily by the sound of his footsteps. The fugitive scurried into a front room and banged the door behind him. Mr. Hardy launched himself against the door, which had a lock that snapped when the door shut. For a moment he was balked. Then he stepped back a few paces and rushed at the door, plunging against it with his shoulder. The woodwork splintered. Another rush, and the door fell open. The detective reeled into the room. His fugitive had disappeared. But the room was faintly lighted, as there was a wide window, and in the gloom the detective could see a dark patch in the floor. It was a trapdoor leading evidently to the cellar. He went down through the opening, finding a flight of stairs which he descended. He could hear footsteps receding through the darkness, but he made his way across the uneven floor of the cellar. The detective stopped and listened. He heard the hurrying footsteps as the smuggler went on to the far end of the cellar. Then, to his great surprise, he heard a voice. In the distance he saw a faint glow of light. Then he saw that the cellar was divided into two parts and that the fugitive had entered a small room. He crept closer. "What's happening?" he heard someone say in a weak voice. "Everything," snarled a voice which he recognized as that of Snackley. The detective's heart leaped. "Everything is happening. The police are here." "The police?" "Yes, the police, state troopers, federal officers, and all. But don't think you're going to have a chance of squealing on us. I'm going to fix you, as I should have done a long while ago." The other voice rose, replete with terror. "No, no. You won't do that, Snackley. Let me live." Fenton Hardy crept swiftly over to the door. He saw Snackley standing by a small cot in a cell-like room. On the cot crouched a haggard man whose hands were handcuffed behind him. His feet were shackled to one leg of the iron cot. Snackley, with a grim look of cruelty on his face, was raising a heavy club he had picked up. There was no time to lose. The detective sprang through the doorway. He plunged at Snackley just as the smuggler raised the club to strike. Snackley reeled against the wall, with Fenton Hardy at his throat. Desperately, the smuggler tried to raise the weapon, but the detective had seized his wrist. They swayed to and fro, stumbling about on the muddy floor. Mr. Hardy had the advantage in that he had taken Snackley by surprise. He pinned the smuggler against the wall, twisting his wrist. The club fell to the floor. Snackley plunged forward and they lost their footing, rolling about in the mud. Suddenly, Fenton Hardy wrenched his arm free, sprawled over and managed to seize Snackley's revolver. He pressed it against Snackley's side. The smuggler gave in. He flung his arms above his head. "I'm licked," he muttered sullenly. They got slowly to their feet, Fenton Hardy keeping a watchful eye on the captive. Upstairs they could hear the uproar continuing as the police still gave battle to the smugglers. "Upstairs," snapped the detective curtly. Without taking his eyes off Snackley, he said to the man on the cot. "We'll come back for you later, Mr. Jones. Xiv, the roundup." The Hardy boys, in the meantime, were in the thick of the struggle. Frank fought desperately with the smuggler he had assailed in the living room of the house, while Joe raced across the yard toward the trapdoor leading to the underground caves. He found that although 3 of the smugglers had been captured by officers in the yard and that as many more were fighting to escape, none of the police had as yet learned of the trapdoor down which some of the men had disappeared. With a shout to a nearby officer who had just succeeded in clapping the handcuffs on one of the smugglers, Joe made his way down the stairs. He heard the officer running over to the edge of the trap and saw the gleam of the flashlight. "Some of them got out this way," Joe shouted back to the officer. The man called to one of his companions and then footsteps clattered on the stairs as Joe went on. He reached the door that opened into the chamber where his father had been a prisoner, but on entering the room he found it empty. There were evidences of hasty flight and the door on the far side of the room was wide open. "Secret passages, eh?" exclaimed one of the officers, as he came into the room. He was a state trooper in uniform. Joe led the way out through the opposite door and down the stairs that led toward the bottom of the cliff. The trooper who had spoken illuminated the way with his flashlight and they clattered on down the stairs until they reached the storage room. Here, everything was in confusion. The escaping smugglers had evidently endeavored to take with them what goods they could, probably the smaller packages containing drugs, for boxes and parcels were overturned and strewn about the floor. "You seem to know this place pretty well," said one of the troopers, as Joe led the way across to the opposite door and stepped out onto the landing. "I've been here before, got in this way," he answered. "There's a water cave below this passage. They've probably made their getaway in the boat." They hastened down the passageway and came at last to the cave. As Joe expected, the boat was gone. "They got away," he said, in disappointment, as the trooper turned the flashlight onto the channel between the rocks. There was a shout from the darkness of the cove. "Give us a light," they heard. Joe gave a shout of joy. It was Tony Preto's voice. Then Joe and the troopers with him heard the steady beat of a motorboat. Joe seized the flashlight and ran out along the path leading to the entrance of the cave. The motorboat was not many yards away. Tony had been searching for the channel. "Right this way," Joe called out. "Head toward the right of the cave and you'll be in deep water. A little further. Good." As the motorboat drew nearer, he saw that it was filled with men and that a rowboat was being towed behind. "We got 'em," cried Tony exultantly. "They were just getting out of the cove in the boat when we came up." "Who is with you?" asked Joe. "Police. The rest of them went up the shore road in a car." "We've caught the whole gang then. They raided the house and got the rest of the smugglers. We thought these fellows had made a getaway." "No chance. Although it was mighty close. They pretty nearly slipped out of the cove right under our noses." The boat came to a stop beside the natural wharf of rock. 1 or 2 of the officers, revolvers in hand, clambered out. 3 of the smugglers had been captured while trying to escape from the cove in the rowboat. "If they'd got out we would never have caught them," said Joe. "They were heading out toward a ship." "A ship?" exclaimed one of the officers, a burly man in plain clothes. He stepped forward. "Did they say anything about a ship?" "A man named Lee Chang has a ship lying in wait outside the bay," said Joe. "I heard them talking about it." "Good," exclaimed the burly man. "Now we'll capture the whole outfit." He turned to Tony. "I suppose your boat is good for another little run." "I'll say it is, sir." "I want as many officers as we can spare," said the burly man. "We'll go out and find that ship. Lee Chang, did you say?" he added, turning to Joe. "That was the name. I know his ship. We've been trying to catch that villain for years. Dost, go on up and see how the rest of the men made out at the house on the cliff and take as many officers as they can spare. There's a passage up through the rocks, I take it." "Regular staircase all the way, sir," remarked Dost, one of the raiding officers. "Good. Don't lose any time." The 3 smugglers were taken out of the boat and handcuffed, then escorted up the stairs, while the burly man, who was the chief of a squad of federal agents undertaking a drive against the smugglers on that part of the coast, remained with the motorboat. Within a short time Dost returned with 3 more officers. He reported that a clean sweep had been made at the house. "They have 'em all handcuffed and sitting in the kitchen," he said. "Mr. Hardy got Snackley." "Snackley?" exclaimed the federal man. "Is it his gang?" "Yes, sir. He got Snackley in the cellar. One of his sons tackled Redhead Blount, one of Snackley's sidekicks, and held him down until the police came in. When we brought our 3 in, that finished the roundup." "It does, so far. We're going out and grab Lee Chang from that ship and that'll clean everything up." The officers got into the motorboat and Joe clambered in beside Tony Preto, who was at the wheel. The craft backed out of the channel into the deeper water of the cove, then sped out into Barmet Bay. "Once we get out of the bay we should see her lights," said the federal officer. "Lee Chang probably has his ship anchored just off the coast." This proved to be the case. The lights of the vessel were soon descried and the motorboat sped toward it through the night. When the boat drew alongside, the federal man roared out, "Ahoy, there!" A voice answered in Chinese. "Speak English," roared the officer. "Throw over a ladder or we'll open fire on you." "Who there?" "The police." Jabbering voices and running footsteps suddenly created a commotion. One of the troopers fired his revolver into the air and very promptly a ladder was lowered over the side of the vessel. "That's better," said the federal man, as he clambered up over the rail, revolver in hand. "I'll just talk to your skipper for a minute." The capture of Lee Chang was without incident. When he was told that Snackley and the gang were captured, the Chinaman, who was a small, wizened little fellow with a villainous countenance, blandly submitted to arrest and consented to be taken ashore. There were only 2 or 3 members of the crew aboard, the others having shore leave, so 2 of the federal men were left in charge of the ship until relief could be sent from Bayport, and the motorboat made its way back to the cove. The roundup was complete. Snackley's smuggling gang had been completely broken up. XXV The mystery explained. The Hardy boys were the heroes of Bayport when the news of the capture of Snackley and his men spread throughout the city next day. As for Tony Preto, he was the envy of all the chums of the 2 lads. "Tony had all the luck," bemoaned Chet Morton, as the boys were all sitting in the barn back of the Hardy home next afternoon. This barn, which had been fitted up as a gymnasium, was a meeting place for the lads on occasions of importance. "We had to have a motorboat," said Frank. "Believe me, I was wishing more than once that the whole crowd was along." "And you'll get the reward for capturing Snackley?" asked Phil Cohen. "Not all of it. Dad gets half. Joe and I split the rest." "You haven't any kick coming. What's going to happen to Snackley?" "He'll probably go to the electric chair," answered Frank soberly. "Why?" "He murdered Felix Pallucker, the miser." "Murdered him?" "Yes. Dad found that out in his investigations. Dad suspected all along that there was some connection between Snackley and the house on the cliff, especially when he found that Snackley and Pallucker had been related. He went out to find out what he could, but the smugglers saw him and captured him." "What about that fellow they had imprisoned in the cellar?" questioned Biff Hooper. "Didn't you say Snackley was just going to kill him when your father saved him?" "That was the young fellow we saved in the bay that day. The young chap who told us his name was Jones. It wasn't his real name, at all. His name is Yates and he was one of the smugglers." "Why was Snackley chasing him that day?" asked Perry Robinson. "It seems that Yates got angry because he didn't get his full share of the money from the last smuggling trip, so he threatened to tell the police on Snackley. The smugglers locked him up, but he got away in one of the motorboats, so they chased him and ran him down. They thought to have killed him in the explosion or else drown him, but Joe and I managed to bring him ashore. We left him at the Kane farmhouse, but the smugglers came along next day and kidnapped him. They kept him prisoner in the cellar of the Pallucker place after that." "I still can't understand about those yells and shrieks we heard the first day we were out at the farmhouse," put in Phil Cohen. "That was just to frighten us away. One of the men in the gang is a sort of halfwit and they had him posted there to frighten people off by yelling and shrieking whenever anyone showed up around the place. "He was the chap who stole our tools from the motorcycles," explained Frank. "But after our visit there," added Joe, "they thought it was too dangerous and that there might be an investigation, so they put Redhead and his wife and one of their men there to pose as renters of the place." "So there weren't any ghosts after all," exclaimed Jerry Gilroy. "Nary a ghost," laughed Frank. "Snackley explained everything this morning in a confession. The whole gang is locked up, even to Lee Chang." Yates, the young fellow they had kept prisoner so long, told the whole story first. He turned state's evidence and told how long the smuggling had been going on, how Snackley had made use of the house on the cliff after killing Palukka, how he fixed up the tunnels in the cliff. He told everything. It seems that Palukka had the smuggling idea in the first place and he spent years fixing up those caves and tunnels. When everything was ready, he called in Snackley, but Snackley didn't like to share with anyone who had a right to a voice in the affair, so he killed the old man, took his money, and brought the smuggling gang in there. Yates told all that. He told so much of it that Snackley saw there was no use bluffing any longer, so he admitted the whole story. "Gosh," sighed Chet. "Just my luck. I was there in time to get scared to death by that halfwit, and there in time to get bawled out and chased off the farm by Redhead and his wife, but I missed out on all the fun at the last." "Not much fun about it," declared Joe. "It didn't seem funny to us when the smugglers caught us in the cave just as we were getting Dad free. And it wasn't any fun hiding in that attic with the bullets coming through the floor, 19 to the dozen," added Frank. "I thought every minute was going to be my last." "No, I guess it wasn't any too funny then," admitted Chet. "You deserve every cent you get out of the reward." "We'll treat the whole gang to a feed as soon as we collect," Joe promised. "We," shouted Chet, turning a handspring. "Now you're talking." The Hardy boys kept their word. Soon after they had received their share of the reward, which was presented to them with many glowing words and congratulations from the federal authorities who had long been trying to put Snackley behind the bars, they gave a dinner in the barn that eclipsed any similar feed in the history of Bayport. "I hope the Hardy boys solve a mystery every week," said Chet, as he confronted his third dish of ice cream. "And I hope they celebrate every success the same way." The Hardy boys were not destined to solve a mystery every week, but it was not long before they were plunged into a maze of events which were fully as exciting as those which led to the finding of the tower treasure and those that followed their first visit to the house on the cliff. The story of their adventures will be told in the next volume of this series, called The Hardy Boys, The Secret of the Old Mill. Tony Preto, conscious of the envying glances of the other lads because he had participated in the eventful climax to the mystery of the house on the cliff, scooped up the last of his ice cream and said, "Once I wanted my father to buy an automobile and he bought a motorboat instead. Now he wants to sell the boat and buy an automobile. Just let him try it. That boat gave me more fun in one day than I'd ever had since we came to the States." The end.